And now we're going to take a look at techniques where we need to think about Photoshop at the time we're taking photographs in order to be able to do something special. And there'll be some more standard techniques like panoramas and HDR, but then we'll look at more specialty techniques as well. Let's start off talking about panoramas. Here is a series of images that I captured in Africa, where I have 1, 2, 3, 4, looks like 5 images. The last 2 look the same, so I could use 4 images. I'm going to select those 4 images, and there are 2 ways of merging this into a panorama. The first method is to go here in Bridge to the Tools menu, to choose Photoshop, and to choose Photo Merge. There's a similar command found in Lightroom if you go to the Photo menu and choose Edit In. Now, if I choose Photo Merge, I'm presented with this choice. And down the left side, I have various methods it could use to distort the individual images to allow them to fit together. Most of the time, you could just use Auto as a starting point, and only if you disliked the end result might you try a second time and force it into one of these other choices. In the middle, this is just a list of the files you're about to merge together. There's a Browse button in case you wanted to add more, but in general you never need to because you already selected them within Bridge. And then down at the bottom, you just need to make sure this checkbox is turned on called Blend Images Together, which is what's going to produce a seamless panorama. There is an extra choice at the far bottom called Content Aware Fill Transparent Areas. Then anytime you stitch a panorama, the end results will not be a perfect rectangle, so by using that choice, it's going to fill any empty areas and turn your end result into a rectangle. And so I might turn that on, and then I click OK. And at this point, it's going to use the Load Files into Photoshop Layers command to stack those images. It's then going to go to the Edit menu, and it's going to choose Auto Align Layers, which is going to get them to line up. And then finally, it's going to go to the Edit menu and choose Auto Blend Layers to make that a seamless panorama. It's really a multi-step process that particular choice automates. It's something you could have done yourself using the individual choices. When you're done, you end up with a selection on your picture. That selection indicates the areas that were empty when it was done stitching the panorama, because it wasn't a perfect rectangle. So those are the areas where it ended up doing a content-aware fill. Now, those are the areas that you should be critical of because there's a good chance that there's duplicated content in there. If I look here at the bottom, I can see this area looks like it's been used 1, 2, maybe 3 times. This little clump of information's been used 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And if you keep looking, you're going to see a lot of repeated content. So that's why they leave that selection visible, so you're aware of which areas will likely have repeated content due to the content-aware fill. And in our retouching session, I talked about how I end up performing general retouching. I could use those skills to further enhance this. Now, if you use that particular choice for stitching your panorama, I would suggest that you adjust your pictures if they were raw files before going through that process. And these images have been pre-adjusted, so they look okay. If you end up going through that process before adjusting your raw files, the end result here is no longer a raw file, and therefore the quality of your results, if you adjust it here, are going to be lower than if you made your adjustments beforehand in Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to close this version, and I want to show you a second method for merging those images. The second method would be to go to the File menu and choose Open in Camera Raw. When you do that, if you have more than one image selected, they show up as thumbnail images on the left side of your screen. And if you go to the little menu that is found just above those thumbnails, you could choose Select All to make sure you work with all the images, return to the menu, and there you're going to find a choice of Merge to Panorama. I'll choose that, and when I do, it says here it's can't find a profile. It's still going to work. If I click OK, and now, unlike the first method I used for stitching a panorama, here I get a preview. And I have 3 choices on how it could bend the photos to make them look good. And I could switch to another choice and get an update. And then try another choice and see what the difference is between them. So instead of just using a setting called auto and then, trusting the results, here I can try each one of the 3 options that are there and see which one is best for this particular image. I can make this a little bigger by grabbing its corner and expanding it. Below that is a choice called boundary warp. And if I bring that up, it's going to warp this image so that it bends the edge of the photograph and stretches it up towards these edges to fill the empty parts. So as I bring up boundary warp, you'll see the edge of the photo pushing closer and closer to being a rectangle. Once you get it all the way up, it will be a nice rectangle. But you have to make sure that that distortion added by warping is not, distorting the image in an undesirable way. So sometimes it's very desirable because of the way it was previously bent, and other times it's not. The other choice you have is instead of distorting it in those areas to fill it in, there's a checkbox here called Fill Edges. And if I turn on Fill Edges, then it's going to do a content-aware fill on those areas. And just like we did when we used the other version. And then if I turn that off, there's also another option down here called Auto Crop. And Auto Crop's not going to distort or fill anything. It's just going to try to produce the largest rectangle of continuous image out of what your results look like. So if I turn on Auto Crop, you won't see those empty areas. So if you try this and you never saw empty areas, the entire time your image looked like a rectangle, it probably meant that Auto Crop was already on. Because unless that's on, then changing this, you don't see the checkerboard that's out there. So for this particular image, I think it's fine to crop in on it, so I'll just turn on Auto Crop. Finally, there's a checkbox here called Apply Auto Settings, and that does the same thing as going into Adobe Camera Raw and clicking the Auto button, which makes it so if your image looked dull because it hasn't been adjusted previously, it might look better. But most of the time I don't have that on because I like to adjust my images from scratch, and I don't like to trust that necessarily. But what's special about this is when I hit the Merge button, it's going to ask me where to save the resulting file. I click Save, and then it'll show up here in the bottom of the Camera Raw window. But what's very special about it is it's still a RAW file. If you started with raw data, raw images, the end result is raw. And that means that there's no quality difference. When it comes to adjusting this image here in Camera Raw, you can either just work with unadjusted pictures, stitch them into a panorama, and after you're done, start adjusting. Whereas the other method that I showed you, I would suggest you pre-adjust the images because the end result is not a RAW file, and you only get the highest quality out of your images if you're really getting full use out of that raw data. So it's nice being able to stitch, especially a really wide panorama, first before adjusting it, because it's often hard to judge exactly how bright it should be if it varies across that panorama. So I'm going to click Done now, and that will be my stitched panorama. Now I got to warn you when shooting panoramas, because I've had some issues in the past that I really wish I would have learned earlier on. And that is, if with an image like this one, I'm in Africa, and I have a really long lens. Don't recall which one it was, but it might have been a 500 millimeter. Let's see if I can find out. No, it doesn't show me here. But I'm assuming I'm using a 500 millimeter lens. And I get in on an elephant on the left side of my frame, shoot it, move over, leave about a third overlap between the last shot I took and the next, take another shot, repeat, repeat, repeat until I make it all the way across. Well, if you're ever using a longer lens, be very careful because the longer the lens you have, usually the narrower the depth of field is. And therefore, the more critical your focus point is. Because as I'm panning across here, there might be an elephant in the frame for almost all of those shots, but that one shot near the left side where there's a gap between the elephants, if it's autofocusing in every shot, then it might focus on what's in the background. And if I'm using a long lens that has a narrow depth of field, suddenly the area that is sharp might end up shifting dramatically. It can still stitch the panorama, but it's just not going to look good. You're going to suddenly look across there and notice that the sharp area suddenly shifts. And so I usually have a button in the back of my camera that can lock the focus, or on my lens, there's a button on the lens itself I can press to lock the focus. And anytime I'm doing a panorama, there's actually two buttons I'm holding in. The one on the lens itself locks the focus, so it's not going to focus between each shot. And then on the back of the camera is an AEL button. That's auto exposure lock. And I'm holding it in as well. And that makes it so as I go across my panorama, the focus point is the same and the exposure is the same all the way across. And that's going to ensure you get higher quality results. Now, we can stitch panoramas even if we use a fisheye lens. And a fisheye lens would really bend things. This is an example. In order to stitch a fisheye, you select the images, and I believe we must use the first method that I showed you, which is this one called photo merge. And if you have a fisheye lens that was used, you got to turn on some extra features. When you're in here, be sure you use auto. I believe it will only work if you use auto. Then be sure to turn on the two middle checkboxes that are here. The geometric distortion correction is what's going to correct for your fisheye lens. And without that turned on, this will likely not work. And then it's optional if you want it to fill the empty areas or not. But I'm going to click OK. And now you'll see that, hopefully, it will be able to stitch multiple fisheye images together. And it did. The area that's selected is the area that would usually be empty. That's where it used content aware fill. Now, I know it still has a lot of distortion. You see that curved horizon line. Well, you can go in here and use the same techniques that I showed you in a different lesson that's part of the complete guide, which was I came in and talked about using filters. And one of the filters we used was called adaptive wide angle. And with that filter, I can come in here and attempt to straighten various areas in my photograph and try to get rid of as much distortion as is practical. And here I'm not being careful because I'm not zoomed in at all. But this might give you the sense that some of those techniques can be useful with fisheye panoramas. Then a second more standardized technique is one known as HDR. Your camera can only record a certain brightness range, and oftentimes the scenes that you're shooting are going to be beyond that range. And when that happens, either the brightest portion of your image will end up solid white with no detail, or the darkest portion of your image will end up solid black with no detail. And so if you want to look at an example, here I was in Southeast Asia, and I found this scene. And this is generally what I captured. I'm here, I'm near Angkor Wat. And if you look in the dark portion of this image, it's really hard to see any detail. Now, I could have changed my exposure and gone brighter, and maybe even brighter. And I didn't go any brighter than this, but if I wanted to see the detail that was actually in this area down here at the bottom, I could have gone even brighter, maybe 2 more shots to get brighter in order to see that detail. But when I do, look at the sky. We're not getting the detail up there. In order to get the detail in the sky, I'd have to shoot darker. Darker. Well, to get the detail over here on the edges, maybe darker. If I do that, I do what's known as bracketing my exposures, then I can combine together those multiple exposures that vary in brightness into a single file that contains that full brightness range. And that's known as high dynamic range, or HDR. When you shoot that, I'll usually end up setting my camera to auto bracketing. It's in the menu system for the camera. And I'm in aperture priority mode, so the aperture setting is consistent between all the shots, and so it's only changing my shutter speed. You can do this handheld, although it will be a higher quality result usually if you end up doing it with a tripod. I'm going to take these images, select all of them, and there's two different ways you could merge this into HDR. The first is you could go to the Tools menu, you could choose Photoshop, and there's a choice called Merge to HDR Pro. If I choose that option, it's going to load those files into layers in Photoshop, and then it's going to merge them together, and it's going to present me with this list of adjustments to apply. In using those sliders, you're going to find some of them make rather radical changes to your picture that don't necessarily always look good. Like that looks pretty terrible. And other ones will just make radical changes, so you have to be rather subtle with the way you move these. Otherwise, it'll look very much fake. Well, I don't use that very often. I only use that when the feature I'm about to show you fails me and doesn't give me an acceptable result. Then this is my backup. So let me cancel this and show you the way I would usually do it. I would still select the same images, but this time I would go to the File menu here in Bridge, and I would choose Open in Camera Raw. When I'm in Camera Raw, in the upper left, I would go to a side menu and tell it to select all the images. I'd return to the same menu and then choose Merge to HDR. Now you can do the same thing in Adobe Lightroom. If you select the images and you go to the Photo menu, there'll be a choice, I think it's just called Merge, or it might be called Photo Merge, and it'll offer you the choice of stitching a panorama or doing HDR, which is what I'm doing here. Now I get a preview in here, and there are some checkboxes on the right. Align images, I almost always have turned on. The only time I wouldn't is when I'm on an extremely stable tripod and I'm using a cable release or another method for triggering the camera where I'm not touching the camera. Then I wouldn't have to try to align the images. But you need that on if you're going to shoot handheld, because the image won't be in the exact same location in each shot. Then at the bottom is a choice called Deghost. And if there's any movement in the scene, if there's any wind, and let's say there's a flag flapping in the wind, or there's a river and the water's in a different position in each shot, then you're going to need to change this Deghost amount. If there's absolutely no motion whatsoever, you could set it to off. And then it's not going to compare the shots and look for motion. But if there's any chance that there was wind in your picture that might be moving things around, I would at least put it on low. There's a little checkbox called Show Overlay, and that'll cause it to put red on top of the picture where it's compensating for motion. And so if it's obvious where the motion is and the red is not covering all of the areas of motion, then you can bump this up to medium. The red will expand the area it's covering, or you could bump it up to high, and it would work on an even larger area. For this particular image, I don't really see any red in it. If I zoomed up, there'd be a small chance there'd be some area. So I'm going to leave it on low because I'm assuming there'd be some sort of motion in there. And then I'm going to choose Merge, and when I do, it will ask me where to save the resulting file. Choose Save. And then the end result will appear at the bottom of the list of thumbnails on the left side of my screen. And what's special about this is not only is it an HDR image, HDR meaning a wider brightness range than a single shot, it's also still a RAW file. And that means changes to things like white balance are going to give you a higher quality result than if you used the first technique that I showed you, which is the technique I use as an alternative to this only when this technique messes up and can't combine images. So at this point, none of the adjustment sliders had been moved. That's because I did not have the checkbox turned on that said auto. And now I can optimize this picture just like I would any other. Most of the time with HDR, to start off with, I just max out the shadows as high as it goes. I bring the highlights as low as it goes. And then I adjust contrast to control how big of a difference is there between bright and dark. After I do that, I treat it like any other photograph. And it doesn't mean I leave highlights as high or as low as it goes and shadows as high as it goes. I might deviate if I don't need that much shadow detail or to darken the highlights that much. But now I'm going to treat this like any other photograph and when I'm processing it. I'm not going to spend too much time on the image itself, though, because this is more about the process of merging it than how to process images. We had a separate lesson on as part of the complete guide that was just about camera raw and use all the techniques I discussed there. When you're done, click OK. And then you're going to end up with your original exposures, and somewhere else will be your HDR file. I saved mine on my desktop so that I could throw it away later, because it was just for demo purposes, but it will usually have the letters HDR near the end of the file name so you can tell that it's that. Now we can combine those two ideas, HDR to get a wider brightness range, and then panorama to get a wider view. So here is an HDR panorama. This is where I took one dark shot, one medium shot, one bright shot. Then I panned my camera over, took another dark, medium, bright. Pan over, repeat, process. Pan over, repeat, process. Pan over, repeat, process. And I probably could have gone even one darker than this, but here they all are. Well, I'm going to come in here and just select all. I'll type Command A to do so. I'm going to go to the File menu and choose Open in Camera Raw. I'm going to go to the menu in the upper left, select all. And this time we have a special command called Merge to HDR Panorama. And that's going to end up doing the HDRs first. Left one first, next one, the next one, the next one, until we have the individual exposures. Then it's going to do the panorama stitch, and it presents me here with the end result. And I can choose which kind of distortion it can use to combine them together. And I have auto crop turned on, so I can see if I would like to do a boundary warp. This is an instance when boundary warp might be useful because you see how curved these lines are in the building. And by doing boundary warp, it might end up straightening them out a little bit more. It's a personal preference, but be critical right near the corners because sometimes you get odd kinks there. And if they're not usable, then you might not use boundary warp. You might instead fill edges, but I think this needs too specific of info. Fill edges is usually only good when you have organic material like dirt on the edges, then it works fine, but when you have straight lines like this that need to remain straight, it'll not usually do a good job. So in this case, I'm just going to use auto crop in order to get a clean looking result. Then I choose merge, and it's right then that it asks me for where I should save it and under what file name. And then of course it will appear at the bottom of my thumbnails. So this is an HDR panorama, which is pretty interesting. It used to be there was a lot of work to accomplish that, and now it's a single command which can merge it for you, and the end result, if you started with raw files, is a raw file. And so I find when I do HDR panoramas, I very frequently use a technique that I demonstrated in a different complete guide class, which is the class that was about smart objects, where I can interpret this image more than once, and I might need to do that one for this middle portion that needs a lot more brightness to it, another different setting for the area outside and all that to create an optimal result. All right, so those are the more traditional ideas. Now let's look at what else we can do when we think about Photoshop at the time we're shooting. Here I was in Amboy, California, and I saw this nice neon sign, and I shot it through a broken window that was in a gas station that's right near. But I was unable to get the neon sign in the distance and the broken part of the glass that's close to me really sharp at the same time. I was just too close to the glass. So I shot 2 shots. I just moved my focus ring to get the area in the distance, shot it, and then moved the focus ring to get the glass sharp and shot it. Well, I'd like to combine those two together. So I'm going to select the 2 images. I'm going to choose Tools, Photoshop, load files into Photoshop layers, and that should end up stacking the 2 images so I get a single document with 2 layers. Next, I'm going to select both layers, and I'm going to go to the Edit menu and choose Auto Blend Layers. When I choose Auto Blend Layers, if I use the setting in here that's called Stack Images, then what it's going to do is it's going to compare those layers. And it's going to, if it finds 2 layers and one of them is sharper than the other in a particular area, it's going to keep the sharper version. And so therefore, if I have an area that's out of focus in one shot and in focus in the other, when it compares those 2, it will keep the area that's in focus. And so all I need to do is click OK. And now if I look at my result, we have sharp glass and we have a sharp neon sign as well. And that can be known as focus stacking, is one way to think of it. And this is something that's more critical to do as you magnify things more. So if you end up doing macro photography of really small objects like flowers, and you want to get the entire depth of the object to be sharp, well, the more you magnify something, the narrower the depth of field is that you get. So you're going to end up with a lot of out of focus areas. And so if you take more than one shot, you can combine them using this technique to get everything sharp. Just be careful, because if you don't adjust the focus a small amount between shots, instead you do it too big, you're going to end up with something like this. Here I was in the Galapagos Islands, and I shot this one. Then behind him, you can see another iguana, so I shot it with him in focus as well. I have a long lens, though, and I wasn't able to get them both sharp and also have a high enough shutter speed. So if you look here, look at the area in between the 2, and notice that it's out of focus in this shot and out of focus in this shot. So if I were to try the same technique on those 2 images, all I have to do is select the 2. And in this case, I was shooting handheld, and if I turn off the top layer, watch the iguana in the back, and you see him shift down and to the left? They're not aligned. I could go to the Edit menu and choose Auto Align Layers, but when it comes to images that have out of focus areas, it will often not be able to handle it very well. Let's see if it did. Yeah, it's not bad. Older versions of Photoshop wouldn't be able to handle that. Then I can choose Auto Blend Layers, but the end result's going to look odd because it's going to be sharp, then it goes blurry, and it goes sharp again. And so that's not really a usable result here. So that just means be careful when you're doing multiple shots. It doesn't mean you just need 2 shots. In many instances, you might need 3, 5, 7, who knows how many, in order to get that full range and focus. Better to take too many pictures than not enough. Now let's talk about time-lapse. Here's a sequence of images that I captured in Africa. I actually set my camera on the ground, and I put a timer on the camera so it would take a picture every few seconds. And once I did that, it started capturing the images, and just happened to be that an elephant came into our camp, and that elephant came right over near my camera. Getting a little nervous by this time. And he's just eating grass and walking through camp. Well, I would like to combine these images together into a panorama. And so to do so, Come on. Here's what we need to do. The first thing we need to do is we probably don't want to work with full-size RAW files because running them as video, my camera is 61 megapixels. That's a massive file. You don't need something anywhere near that big for video. The second thing is we need the numbering of these photos to be sequential. If there are any gaps in the numbering, like here, let's see, I have number 90 on the end, then it jumps to 94, then 97, then 00. They're not sequential. If we do this with a non-sequential series, it will assume that it should have been sequential and there'll be empty frames and it'll look really weird. So what I'm going to do is select all. I'm going to then go to the Tools menu. I'm going to choose Photoshop, and there's a choice called Image Processor. Image Processor is designed to scale images and save them in different file formats. And so we're going to use this. With the Image Processor, I'm going to tell it what save location I want to go to. And for me, I'll put it on my desktop. Then I'm going to come in here and say Resize to Fit. And I might as well make this so it fits within the size of HD TV. That's 1920 by 1080. I'm going to keep the quality as high as it can go so we don't degrade the quality at all. And then I'm going to hit Run. That's going to open each one of those images, scale it down, and save them out as a JPEG file. And it may take it a little while to do it. Once it's done doing that, the next thing we need to do is make sure we've dealt with the naming, in that the number on the end of each file is sequential. There are no gaps. Otherwise, there'll be areas with empty frames. And we can do that, again in Bridge. We're going to do it by going to the Tools menu and choosing Batch Rename. Take it just a moment to finish. Now, ahead of time, I would have adjusted these pictures. I would have selected all. I would have gone into Camera Raw, chose Select All on Camera Raw, move the sliders around until the images look good, because our end result here will not be a RAW file, and therefore we wouldn't get as high a quality in an adjustment afterwards than we would if we did before. Should be done in a minute here. I didn't count how many files were in there, so hopefully it doesn't take an hour for it to finish. Looks like it's done. Now I'm going to return to Bridge. I'm going to click on my desktop. And in my desktop is a folder called JPEG. And that's where it saved it. It'll be called whatever file format you told it to use. I'm going to select all by typing Command-A, go to the Tools menu, and choose Batch Rename. With Batch Rename, I'm going to tell it to rename it in the same folder. And down here, I can create a formula for how you make a file name. I can hit the minus signs that are here to clear things out. And I'm just going to start with text, and I'll just call it image. And then I'll hit this little plus sign, and I'll tell it that I would like a sequence number. And that means it's going to number these files. And I tell it how many digits. I don't think I have more than 999 pictures in there, so 3 digits should be fine. But otherwise, that'll be fine. Down here at the bottom, it gives you a preview. There's an example of an existing file name, and here's what it's going to be renamed. It's going to do it to a total of 86 files. I hit Rename, and it only takes it a moment, and suddenly all those files are renamed. But now we need to do something to get it to be a time lapse. And to do that, I go to Photoshop, I go to the File menu, and I choose Open. And then I'm going to point it at the folder that we were just in, and I'm going to select the very first file within the folder. Then in this Open dialog, and this is just the normal Open screen where I just went to the File menu and choose Open, once I've selected that first file, down here's a checkbox called Image Sequence, and that's the key to making this work. Now when I choose Open, it's not going to just open that first image. It's going to open all of the images. And as long as the numbers are in sequence, then when I click Open, it's just going to ask me what my frame rate should be. This is going to determine how quickly this plays back. If I choose 30 frames per second, I could take the number of frames divided by 30, and that would tell me the number of seconds long this would be. So the lower the number, the longer my animation will be. I'll do 24 frames per second as a starting point, click OK, and it's already done. To play it back, you go to the window menu and you're going to find a choice called Timeline. And down in the timeline is a play button right here. And now we have our time lapse. If you want to save out that time lapse in a file format that is related to video, I believe you could choose, let's see, File, Export, and it's been a while since I've done it, so take me just a moment. Right here, Render Video. And then you'll see options related to video file formats. But the key to making that work is to ensure that the file names are in sequence. And if they're not, it's not going to look good. Now, there's something else we can do related to that, and that would be we can create looping animations. And let me just see if I have, here's a frame animation. Here's what I captured. The sun has already gone down, it's twilight. I found the outlines of some, I don't know if you call them mountains, I can't think of what you call them, hoodoos or something similar. And then I waited for traffic to come by. And whenever a car came by, I just hit the shutter button multiple times and I captured these sequences. This was a while later that these cars came through. And I now want to turn that into an animation that will play those. So what I'm going to do is select all of these by typing Command A. And I'm going to choose Tools, Photoshop, Load Files into Photoshop Layers. That's going to stack all of these. It says it's busy. If I hit yes, I bet you it's not busy. Every single time it tells me that it's busy, it never is. If it ever truly is busy, what that means is back in Photoshop, there's a dialog box open, like you're adjusting an image with levels and you haven't clicked OK yet. But it will commonly complain, but rarely actually have an issue. Now we're going to use that same window called Timeline. So if you don't already have it on your screen, you go to the window menu, and that's where you can find the timeline. And there are two different kinds of timelines you can have. And if you go to the side menu over here, I think that's where we might be able to switch. You can have either a frame animation or a normal video animation. It's actually right here. In the middle, there's a drop down. So before we were using a video timeline, which is when we had our time lapse. We want this set to frame animation, and then you want to click this button that says Create Frame Animation. So now it thinks about your document as if it's an animation. There's only one frame, which it looks like our current one, and I'm going to go to the right side of the timeline, click on the side menu, and there's a choice there called Make Frames from Layers. And that means just make a slideshow of all our layers, so we show one at a time. So if I were to hit the play button, you can see the cars going by and doing all this stuff, but the problem is the sky only gets bright for one of those frames. So what I want to do is I'm going to come in here and go to the side menu of the frames thing and select all the frames. So we're working on them all, and I'm going to turn on the eyeball for our bright sky so that it will be visible in every single one of those frames. So I made sure the frames were selected, and then I turn on the eyeball for that. I'm going to hit play, and let's see what we have now. The problem is that that top layer obscures the view of all the layers that are underneath. So I'm going to change the blending mode of it to a choice called Lighten. Lighten means only allow the areas here that are brighter than what's underneath to show up. So now let's see. Oh, I didn't have all my frames selected. So let's go to the side menu. If you want a change that's going to happen across all the frames, you got to select all the frames first, then come up to this layer and set it to lighten. If I did it when there was only one frame active, it's only for that one frame worth of time. There we go. Now we got the cars going by. And if you want it to be no cars for a while, hit stop. And at the very end of your animation, just scroll to the very last frame, click on it, and there's a number underneath it. It says 0 seconds. That's how long it's going to pause at the end. I might set mine for 1 second. Now if I hit play, the cars go by, but once it gets to the end, it'll pause for a second before starting up again. Now, if you want to save this kind of file, this is a frame animation. You want to save this in the GIF file format. Usually I would go to File, Export, and I'm used to using Save for Web, and you'd save it as a GIF file. Then you can have these. This is how you make, what do they call them? My brain's thinking of panelage, but that's not the case. I can't think of the name of it, but when there's slight motion in a photo that's just continuous, like somebody's hair going in the wind. Now, there's a lot of other things that I do with these techniques. Let's take a look at one which would be light painting. At nighttime, usually about 30 minutes after the sun goes down, it's dark enough to do light painting. And if you have a blue sky instead of overcast, I would start taking a photograph maybe 30 minutes after sunset and try to just get the sky. That's what I did here. I was in Grand Teton. And then I'm going to leave my camera on a tripod so it doesn't move from when I took this shot. And I'm going to start doing slower or shorter shutter speeds. This one here might have been a minute and a half or something to get that sky to show up. But then I'm going to start doing maybe 30 seconds to 2-minute exposures, and I'm going to grab a flashlight, and I'm going to walk into the scene that's here and start lighting objects with my flashlight. I can paint it, imagine it's like a fire hose, and you just need to dampen down a building. Well, you start on the left side, get it wet, and then work your way across, except for you doing it with light. So here's one of my shots. There's a barn there, and I started painting the left side. I'm standing maybe, I don't know, about a dozen feet away from this building, and I'm painting the light. I'm just off to the side. And I paint the light across the building during a long exposure. Then I close my shutter, I open it again, and I go light another portion, in this case the rooftop. And I close the shutter, open it again, and shoot another spot. And do that again. Here I'm right at the camera, I believe, and I'm putting the flashlight near the ground and spraying it across the ground. Get the front again, edge, maybe get a tree. I walked way over there to get that. I have a little remote that I can hold in my hand, so I don't actually have to walk to the camera each time. Well, I'm going to select all those images with Command A. I'm going to go to the Tools menu and load files into Photoshop Layers. It says it's busy, but I know it's not. It'll take it just a moment to create a document that contains all those images. I no longer need the timeline, so I'm going to go to the side menu of the timeline panel and choose Close. And now I'm going to combine these layers together. Now, in a separate lesson for the complete guide, we talked about blending modes. I'm going to use one here. I'm going to select all of these layers, and I'm going to go to the top of my Layers panel. There's a pop-up menu, and I'm going to change it to a choice called Lighten. When I do, all of those layers will combine together. And it's going to make it so the top layer can only brighten what's under it. And if you look at the top layer, most of it's solid black, and solid black isn't capable of brightening, so that part won't show up. And then the one below it, this is only going to be able to lighten what's underneath it. So these solid black areas wouldn't show up. Only where there's enough light to be brighter than what's down here will it show up. So we get this. There is an alternative mode if I select all these, and it's called Screen. Screen is going to add together the light that was in each one of those layers. It will always produce a brighter result, and sometimes can be nice if their end result was looking a little dark. But I'm going to use Lighten mode. But now that doesn't mean you're stuck with this end result. Since we have these on separate layers, I can turn a layer off and back on again to decide if I like it and what it contributes to the image. And then I can go to the next layer down and do the same thing. And as I find different layers, this one here I wish was warmer. I wished it looked more yellowish like the front of the barn. Well, I can go down here. If I do an adjustment layer, I'd have to clip it to that layer so it only affected it. But if I come here to Image Adjustments, this would apply to the layer directly. Then when we talked about adjusting color, I mentioned that each one of these colors has an opposite, and the opposite of blue is yellow. So if I bring down blue, should get more yellow. Oh, there it is. But once I do, it looks too green, so I can choose green from here and lessen that as well. The opposite of green is magenta. There we go. Click OK. And then I can go to the next layer and decide, do I like it? To me, that's too bright. So I click on that layer and I lower the opacity to control how strong is it. And I could do a similar adjustment to make that more yellow if I wanted to. Go to the next layer down, turn it off and on, and decide that's too strong. I'm going to lower its opacity to lessen it. And I wish it wasn't so bright near the edge of the frame. Well, there you could add a layer mask. Grab my brush, and with a huge soft edge brush, I don't want to completely remove it, so I'm going to lower my opacity. I might bring my opacity down to about 20, and I'm just going to paint down here to try to lessen that. But that's a layer mask with my opacity turned down. And I just continue working the image. Each one I turn on and off and say, do I like what that's doing? No, it's too much in most of the areas, but I do like what it's doing to the window that's in there. Well, so just add a mask. And if you don't like what it does in most areas, you can invert the mask, which turns it black. It makes it so it's not showing up anywhere. Then I come in here and paint with white to control where it shows up. And say, I like that right here where the window is. And do the same for the next layer. I don't like there, it gets some spill onto the building itself, so I add a mask. I'll paint with black and get this extra spill off the building. Here, maybe I don't like, there's a little fence over there, and it looks like a car might have driven by, so I add a layer mask, paint with black, and say, I don't want that fence. I'd be a little more careful than I'm being, but you get the idea. I see a red line in there. That means a car went by. That's its taillights. And I'm going to turn off these layers one at a time to see when does it go away. There it is. So that's the layer I add a layer mask to. I paint with black and get rid of it. And so you get the idea that light painting, by taking multiple exposures and combining them in Photoshop, is much more versatile than trying to do it in a single exposure. And the only other thing I would do here is I'm going to create a brand new empty layer, and there's one little spot right here, a little red light that was on during all the exposures. I'll use the spot healing brush to get rid of it and this little spot above. So there is my light painting. So in Photoshop, you can do a lot more if you think about Photoshop at the time you're behind your camera. And the more you can start making a connection between shooting and Photoshop, the more you're going to start developing techniques like these to get more out of your images. And I do all sorts of techniques like these, and I find the more I do, the more I really enjoy the shooting and compositing process. So I hope you've been enjoying Photoshop, the Complete Guide.